Every tall tale has an origin, a seed that grew and bloomed into something larger than itself. Many people believe that as society has progressed to where we are now, that tall tales has become an obscurity that only some people still tell. But in an ocean of murder and death, an ocean we call true crime, one tall tale has grown and infestated public conception. 19th century sensational journalism has created the current view we have on HH Holmes. What that means is that there are two sides to the story, or rather there are two stories. One is the public conception, the tall tale, and the other is the true, documented story. There's a lot of layers to this, exaggerations sprinkled in here and there. It's like a wishing well, full of coins, but most of the coins landed on heads instead of tails. And before we can flip them so that we can see the tails, the truth, we need to know the heads. So in this episode of Ages of Murder, I'm going to tell you about the heads, I'm going to tell you about the tails, but we need to separate them. If you came here only wishing to learn about the true tale, I will have a timestamp posted in the comments. But I recommend learning about both. That way the bigger picture will be easier to see. Because at the end of the day, it all comes down to one man, one source, one seed. And that seed is HH Holmes. Herman Webster Mudgett was born in 1860. He may have been born as Herman Webster Mudgett, but he died as HH Holmes. He had many names throughout his life, but he's going to be referred to as Holmes in this video, as to not create too much confusion, because the case is already confusing as it is. There's no need to add to the mess. Apparently young Holmes was a smart kid from the beginning, and his father was a wealthy and respectable citizen, although he would show signs of sadism and hatred towards small animals and younger kids as he reached his teens. Despite his devious side, he was a good student. His prospects looked good. In 1878 he started his medical study. In his studies he worked in a laboratory, and here is where his claimed evil genius mind started working. It's claimed he stole corpses from the laboratory and would disfigure them, making them unrecognizable. Then he would place them to be found, having the police thinking they were victims of unfortunate accidents. He had also set up life insurance in his name for these fake family members, earning him some nice income. After that, nothing was heard or seen from Holmes for 6 years. It wasn't until 1885 that he popped up. He had by that time married a woman, and together they had an infant child. But Holmes, the cold, calculating sadist that he was, had no time to raise kids. He left them both and moved on to Chicago. There he found a new woman he married, despite still being technically married to his previous wife. In Chicago, Holmes was a charismatic and flirtatious man. He swindled and scammed people he came across. Then, in 1887, Holmes began working in a drugstore. The drugstore was owned by an elderly lady, and she was happy to have such a young, handsome man help her out in the shop. Not long after establishing himself in the drugstore, the elderly owner disappeared without a trace, and Holmes claimed that he had purchased the store from her. For 2 years he operated the drugstore and added a jewelry counter in the front of it, a scam to sell stolen valuables. Then in 1889 he looked out on the empty lot across the street. An idea started forming in his head. He was going to build a massive hotel. The construction of his dream castle began, and during this time he met Ned Connor. He hired Ned to work in the shop, and Ned arrived in Chicago with his wife and daughter. But Holmes, the sociopath that he was, started having an affair with Ned's wife Julia, and Ned eventually decided to pack up his things and leave his wife and daughter in Holmes' care. For 3 years Holmes and Julia were a couple. She was brought into many of his swindles. Holmes took out a large life insurance policy on Julia and her daughter, and on Christmas 1891 they both disappeared, never to be found again. By 1892 the construction across the street was finished, an imposing building. It had 60 rooms and 51 doors carved into oddly placed walls. The building was riddled with trapdoors, hidden staircases, secret passages, rooms without windows, chutes that led into the basement, and a staircase that opened out over a steep drop to the alley behind the house. Holmes was the mastermind behind the construction. He overlooked every single thing that happened, and as it was being built, he fired workers and hired new ones on an almost daily basis. The first floor contained stores and shops, while the upper floors could be used as living quarters. Holmes had an office on the second floor, but most of the rooms were for guests. Guests that seemingly disappeared. So-called evidence would later be found to show that Holmes used some of the rooms as asphyxiation chambers, where his victims were suffocated with gas. Other chambers were lined with iron plates and had blowtorch-like devices fitted into the walls, apparently used in torture, where the room would be heated up with someone closed inside, like a big oven. Holmes installed a dissecting table in the basement and maintained his own crematory. There was also acid vats and pits filled with quicklime, where bodies could be conveniently disposed of. Somehow this one man had built a castle of murder and torture in the middle of Chicago. But how could he kill so many people without eyebrows being raised? Well, the World Fair was in town, and many tourists visiting the city needed somewhere to stay. Conveniently, Holmes had just constructed his own murder castle. No one knew. The haunting building stood ready in 1892, and it would be a well-kept secret until 1894 when detectives could investigate the mansion. Holmes had conspired with a man to take out a life insurance and to fake the man's death, but Holmes didn't intend to fake anything. He killed the man for real and then set fire to the corpse. Meanwhile, he was holding the man and his wife's children in his care. He had the 2 younger kids kept away from their mother, who had no idea that her husband was actually dead. Holmes told her that her husband was okay and in hiding. But at some point, Holmes killed the 2 young children and buried them in the basement of his home, something that would be damning to him, and one might wonder how a man that supposedly disposed of hundreds of corpses in his murder castle could be so clumsy with these 2. Anyway, I will go into this whole story in more detail in the second half of the episode. It's an integral part of who HH Holmes really was, and it deserves to be told in better detail and more truthfully. So let's jump ahead a little bit. The castle stood ready in 1892, and in 1894 HH Holmes sat behind bars. While behind bars, he is said to have told people that he was becoming the devil, and he admitted to a whole bunch of murders. This is when police started to investigate the so-called murder castle. The following is the official narrative of what they found inside. They found hinged walls and false partitions. Some rooms had 5 doors and others had none. There were secret and airless chambers hid underneath floorboards where iron plate-lined walls would eliminate the screams of unfortunate victims trapped inside. Holmes' own apartment had a trap door in the bathroom, which opened to reveal a staircase, which led to a windowless cubicle. In the cubicle there was a large chute that tunneled through the basement, used as a quick disposal of freshly made corpses. One notable room was lined with gas fixtures. Here, Holmes would seal his victims in, flip a switch in an adjacent room and wait. Another chute was nearby, another disposal. All of the doors and some of the steps in the castle were connected to an intricate alarm system. Whenever someone stepped into the hallway or headed downstairs, a buzzer sounded in Holmes' bedroom. When police investigated the menacing floorboards, it is said they found a pile of bones. Most of them were animals, but some of them were said to be human, so small that they had to have belonged to a child, no more than 6 or 7 years old. In the cellar they found even more grisly things. Down there beside a blood-covered operating table, they found a woman's blood-soaked clothes. Another surgical surface was nearby, along with a crematory, an array of medical tools, a bizarre torture device, and shelves of disintegrating acids. Holmes also had a very unique way of disposing of the remains. After dropping his victims down through the chutes, he would dissect them, clean them, and sell the organs or skeletons to medical institutions or on the black market. A lot of people went missing during the World's Fair. Many is said to have stayed at Holmes' newly built hotel. Today, people say that the number of victims attributed to Holmes is impossible to corroborate. He had built the factory made for one purpose: murder. He had big acid baths and human-sized stoves to dispose of remaining body parts. Some people claim he had killed over 200 people. Some say he killed over 1,000. Holmes himself confessed to 27 murders. And let's end this first part, the official narrative of this documentary, with what has been quoted as words spoken by HH Holmes himself. I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. This was a quote HH Holmes never made. Lies. I can see what people back then thought. The journalists were sensational beyond anything we see today, and the police were incompetent at best. But we have to start over again. We have to go back to the beginning, and we have to understand the times that allowed such a legendary tale to take hold. H.H. Holmes grew up a sweet young boy. His mother would say that he never hurt animals and that he never tormented other kids. He was too kind-hearted to do such a thing. Of course, that might just be his mother being blind to the truth, but it plants a seed of doubt. And it's just the opening act. Holmes was never a genius. He was a good student, he got along well with his peers, and he had a normal childhood. People that knew him during his upbringing said that he wasn't really anything extraordinary. He wasn't a genius, but he wasn't stupid either. He was average. Vanilla. H.H. Holmes doesn't exactly display signs that many serial killers do, but he did have some problems with his social life and the interactions he made. Holmes was cross-eyed, something that made it difficult for him to make eye contact with people. Witnesses from Holmes' childhood all the way up to his execution would state that he rarely made eye contact, something that made him seem like a compulsive liar. At 16 years old, H.H. Holmes fell in love with a young woman named Clara. She would become his first wife, and technically his only legal wife. She also became the mother of his son, Robert. Holmes is said to have married 4 other women in his life, but Clara wasn't like the others. He had married the other women to gain something, to profit, but Clara was different. He married Clara because he really did love her, but the marriage wouldn't last. Holmes was a womanizer and didn't conduct himself as properly as a married man was to conduct himself back in those Victorian days. Not that it's acceptable to be married and a womanizer today, but things were just fancier and more proper back then. If Holmes had been growing up in the 1980s, I bet that he would have aspired to be a rock star. He had 2 things that he wanted, 2 things that occupied his mind. He wanted women and he wanted money. He wanted power, desperately. He would sit down with elderly widows in the town every day, talking to them and drinking with them, charming them. No one really knew why, but the most probable reason was that he was looking for some sort of financial gain. And while most of the more darker and sadistic sides that has been said about him is pure fiction, he did have some odd traits. He was really invested in his medical studies. He would set up a lab in his room and at one point even brought work home with him. One of the cleaners in the building would be sweeping in Holmes' room one day when she swept up something from under his bed. It smelled really bad. It was a dead infant, brought home from his studies. He was told to never do such a thing again, and he never did. Holmes did like dissecting bodies in his studies, but at some point during his studies he started to run out of funds. He needed to do something to support himself, so he started teaching instead. His students said that he was very stern in his classes, and that he very much fit the old saying of spare the rod and spoil the child. There were many complaints made about Holmes during his teachings. At one point he was almost about to get fired, but at the last minute he pleaded and begged the superintendent to let him keep his job. Considering that he had his studies and a wife and an infant son to support, he was allowed to keep his job. I think it's clear that he was frustrated during this time. He wanted to be rich, but he was barely getting by. He wasn't really a good teacher. When the annual town report gave him a nice chunk of criticism, he got really mad. He wrote long letters and claimed that he would get even. Think of it as an argument online these days. When you see two people argue in the comment section on some social media platform, that's pretty much what Holmes did, only he wrote a 10-page letter. Holmes moved with Clara and his son baby Robert to study at Michigan University in 1882. Even though he brought his beloved family with him, his marriage was far from steady or solid. Holmes' mother and sister was pressuring him to end it. Especially his sister thought that Clara wasn't bright enough or refined enough for Holmes. But divorce was a social stigma back in those days. Today they happen all the time, but it really was frowned upon. And it didn't help that Holmes started abusing Clara. She was often seen with black eyes and bruises on her face, and eventually Clara and baby Robert moved back to New Hampshire. The marriage was still legally intact and Holmes would visit his wife sporadically, but the marriage was for all intents and purposes over. It never ended in a bang, but with a whimper. He studied for a while, and after his college tenure he for a short time worked as a physician. At this time he was a big womanizer, and he would flirt with many of the women he met. He even proposed to 2 of them. One of these women was a relative of a patient that had passed away in Holmes' care. It was her father. Years later, her father's passing would be seen as suspicious, the theory being that Holmes could have poisoned him to come closer to the woman to perhaps get his hands on a will the dead man had left behind. Whenever he made serious moves with a woman, he almost always did it with ulterior motives. It doesn't mean that he never liked them, but there was never any real love. As the swindler he was, he would during this time commit frauds. At one point, when a smallpox outbreak had occurred, he would travel around claiming that he was there to administer the vaccine. But each vial of vaccination cost 25 cents. Sounds cheap today, but 25 cents was worth more back then. Holmes truly was a swindler, but he wasn't as slick and smooth as people claim he is. He often got caught in his frauds, and there is piles of legal paperwork from a dozen lawsuits and trials he suffered through during his years in Chicago. He was using different aliases all the time, and he was committing insurance frauds. Holmes had a lawyer named Edward Moore that helped defend him in a lot of cases, but he eventually got so sick of Holmes' constant fuck-ups that he vowed to never work with him again unless he cleaned up his act. Holmes was clearly a manipulative criminal, but he was far from a mastermind of any kind. He was a desperate man seeking fortune. Then he met another woman. Her name was Myrta, and he married her under his new name Henry Howard Holmes. the name he would be infamous for. She had arrived in Chicago engaged to a man named Henry Graham, but Henry Graham had gone missing in 1886. He was said to go meet relatives. If he actually went missing is unclear, but the paper trail isn't there. This was a long time ago. Anyone alive back then died long ago. But Holmes married Myrta, even though he was still legally married to Clara. That's when he purchased the empty land on 63rd Street in Englewood. There he was going to build what would become known as the Murder Castle. Holmes constantly changed the name of the owner of the land, probably to evade paying back loans he had taken. First Myrta was named as the owner, and then her mother was named as the owner, and on it went, from person to person, keeping Holmes as the actual owner while the responsibility kept bouncing around, keeping the debt off his ass. He had been a swindler for years, so he was pretty good at it now. His struggling days was clearly coming to an end. The story of the pharmacy Holmes came to own has often been told as I told it in the first part. Although in the version I told, he only killed the elderly owner and took ownership of the store. Some accounts claimed he not only killed the elderly lady, but also her sick husband she was caring for. But whatever people say, it's based on small bits of information that was sensationalized by pulp writers later on. The truth is that he bought it. He made an agreement with the elderly Mrs. Horton to repay a monthly fee of $100 every month. And so he was the owner. And one more thing, there never was an elderly Mrs. Horton and a sickly elderly husband. The Hortons certainly was the owners before Holmes bought the place, not in blood but in cash. But the Hortons was a young married couple. I didn't mean to mislead you. This part is meant to tell the truth only, but it's important that people realize how many holes there is in the stories told about Holmes. I did a quick search of HH Holmes on Google before this, and all 3 articles I looked at stated he murdered an elderly lady and then took over the shop. One of them kept the detail of the sick and dying husband in. So if someone looks Holmes up and reads that, they're fed lies. I don't think people spread the lies willingly, but I do think that there is a need to want to believe in these things. It's a fascinating story, but a fascinating story should never replace the truth. If you're still doubting me, you might say, how do you know he didn't kill them just because they were young? Well, in 1894, when Holmes had been arrested and was sitting in jail, Mr. and Mrs. Horton was still living in Chicago with their 2 children. The Hortons lived well into the 20th century and are buried not far away from where the pharmacy stood. A pretty big lie debunked. It's hard to claim they disappeared when you can visit their graves to this day. In 2019, Holmes had started constructing the building across the street now, but he wasn't doing it for the building, it was all about money. He had loaned money from several investors and was manipulating contracts. To say that Holmes' building was a castle or menacing in any way is dumb. The first 2 floors was designed by architects Charles Berger and Edward Golliner. The first floor was going to be a store. The second floor would be apartments where Holmes, his wife and his employees would live, and the third floor was supposedly built to function as a hotel. So already the holes are shining through. People always say that he built a huge building, a large hotel, that he was the mastermind behind it, the architect. But the truth is that the building wasn't anything special. It was just a building that was designed to fit into the environment of the other buildings, making it look pretty mundane. But the third floor was the only part built to function as a hotel, and it wasn't exactly strange. The city was growing rapidly, and new buildings were being constructed all over the place. But the third floor, the area that would function as a hotel, wasn't built at the same time as the other floors. In the beginning, Holmes only built 2 floors. It was the store and the apartments. He only added the third floor when the World's Fair came to town. It was for now consisting of 2 floors. And a few years later, journalists allowed to trample all over the crime scene would say that here is where they found the secret chamber and secret staircase. The only issue with that would be the word secret. Everyone who worked for Holmes knew about them. The staircase was just used as a more effective way for employees to get to different floors, and the chamber was actually used by some of the employees to sleep in. It was basically a bedroom. Holmes was also operating the store and the building without paying a single cent. When he was sued for not paying the debts, he simply stated that he wasn't the owner. His mother-in-law had been named the owner, so he couldn't be held responsible. Holmes' lawyer, Edward Marr, who had decided to pick up arms with Holmes again, handled all his legal battles. It wasn't petty swindles anymore. This was big scams, contracts that had been manipulated. Also that Holmes could earn as much money as possible without paying anything. Money is a strong motivating factor, and it's real. It's normal. Holmes only occasionally visited his mother back in New Hampshire at this point in his life. He was slipping deeper and deeper into his own world. He had his henchmen working for him, his scams, his criminal organization. Apart from these more elaborate schemes, he was still doing outright swindles. He would buy goods on credit, sell it for cash, and never pay the original bill. It was in 1891 that the first possible victim attributed to HH Holmes can be discovered. Holmes had been pulling some elaborate scams with his pharmacy store, selling it to a man named Ned. Ned had someone watch the store to see how good the sales were going, and Holmes at that point had his friends and former employees come into the store and pretend to purchase expensive items. So Ned eventually bought it, but of course there was a lot of issues with it. Eventually he sold it back to Holmes for a cheaper price, but during that time Holmes was still present in the shop. One day one of the men Holmes owed money to came to town. His name was John DeBrule, and in an odd incident he fell dead to the ground outside Holmes' shop. He was convulsing and eventually went limp. It said that Holmes poured a dark chemical liquid in DeBrule's throat. Holmes did have knowledge when it came to chemicals, and it's possible he could have seen DeBrule fall to the ground, and then used the opportunity to get rid of a man that he owed a small fortune to. But nothing has been proven. This is the real Holmes. The picture I paint to you is the real man behind the legend, and the story of HH Holmes is far from over. It's a fascinating story even when we strip away all the lies and tall tales. I'm not here to change your mind. I'm telling you the truth. And it's up to you if you're going to accept it. I had a hard time accepting it when I first learned about it. My first reaction was frustration, and I don't know why. Why would it be angering to learn that a horrible story isn't true? Let's talk a little bit about the serial killer HH Holmes. What is a serial killer? I'm not gonna repeat some Wikipedia article about what a serial killer is, but when I look at HH Holmes, I don't really see a serial killer. The theories that he killed to satisfy a deeper need or to get sexual satisfaction is pure speculation. They came from really, really bad sources. It seems more likely he was killing people for financial gain or self-preservation. There's no doubt that he got more cold-hearted as time went on, but he was more like a gangster. Many of the alleged victims attributed to Holmes were just rumors. It was people that had heard about Holmes and thought to themselves, I haven't seen her in a while. I think she was in Chicago when Holmes was there. He must have killed her. In many instances, the people attributed to Holmes' list of victims weren't even missing at all, like with the Hortons. But none of that means that Holmes is not a killer. Back in 1889, a man named Ned Connor, his wife Julia Connor, and their daughter Pearl arrived in Chicago. It didn't take long before Ned got a job in Holmes' store that he ran, but the marriage between Ned and Julia was troubled, and it didn't take long before Holmes and Julia began having a love affair. But it wasn't as if Holmes cucked Ned. The marriage was really, really breaking down, and Julia had at times threatened to kill herself. The married couple had agreed that one day they would go their separate ways. They seemed to have hated each other. Ned Connor eventually moved away in 1890 to work for someone else. During this time, Holmes was having an affair with Julia while he was still married to Myrta and technically married to Clara. Myrta even gave birth to a daughter. HH Holmes was a petty man. As Ned left, Holmes pulled one last swindle on him and fucked him out of a few $100s. Now Holmes was having an open affair with Julia, and he had her living with his wife. Holmes had started to entangle Julia in his swindles. He was using her name and announced new corporations under her name. But then on Christmas 1891, both Julia and Pearl disappeared. One day the people living in the apartment complex of Holmes' castle noticed that the apartment Julia and Pearl had been staying in was empty. Days turned into weeks, and at one point one of the residents could hear noises coming from the apartment again, and thought to her relief that Julia and Pearl were back. But they weren't. A new family had moved in. It's not very likely that they just moved away either. Everything Julia and Pearl owned were still inside the apartment. Why would they just move away and leave their clothes behind? Holmes would later give several different stories of what he had done to Julia and Pearl, but there's one that seems the likeliest. The likeliest sequence of events would have been that Holmes had impregnated Julia. The two had agreed that Holmes would perform an abortion on her, but it went wrong. She died during the abortion, and with Julia dead, Holmes didn't have any enthusiasm of taking care of Pearl. She wasn't even his daughter. She was just a burden, and letting her live while her mother just went missing would have gotten people to wonder. No. Instead, he poisoned Pearl, and told people that Pearl and Julia had gone to Davenport to attend Julia's sister's wedding. A few years later, when police began digging in the cellar of the castle, they did find bones belonging to a child, most likely 6 years old. Pearl was 6 years old. Then Holmes met another young attractive girl. Her name was Emmeline Seagrand. Emmeline began working for Holmes, and for a while it's believed that the two carried on a love affair. But sometime in 1892, Emmeline disappeared too. She had told her best friend that she was going to visit her parents, and her friend seemed to think that Emmeline had started to change her mind about Holmes. She thought that maybe she was trying to get away from him. After she had been gone for some time, the friend asked Holmes where she were. Holmes then told the friend that Emmeline had gone off to get married. This shocked the friend. Why wouldn't her closest and best friend tell her this? This Emmeline's parents got certificates of their daughter's marriage to a man named Robert Phelps. But it was odd. Emmeline's sister went to Chicago but could never locate anyone by the name of Robert Phelps. Then it didn't take long before Holmes started telling people that Emmeline and her new husband were moving to Europe. Emmeline's best friend never saw her again. Whatever happened to Emmeline is unknown, but she seemed to have just fallen off the face of the earth. She would later be added to the list of victims attributed to Holmes. There was now up to 3 possible victims, and the reason they only remain as possible is because no conclusive evidence or identifiable remains were ever discovered. The bones thought to have belonged to Pearl could never be proven to belong to Pearl, but they most likely did belong to her. Then came Minnie Williams, a young woman. She had talent and was working to build a career as an actress. She had grown up as an orphan as both her parents had died. It has been said that Holmes had met Minnie back in Colorado some time before she moved to Chicago, and the reason she moved to Chicago in the first place is because her fiancé had died in an accident while working in Denver, Colorado. Years later, people would claim that Holmes had gone up to Denver to kill the man himself, but that couldn't have been possible. At the time the man died, Holmes was in Chicago, taking out a loan on a bicycle company. It was now 1893, and Minnie Williams had begun working for Holmes. The World's Fair was in town, and Holmes' newly renovated third-floor hotel was finished. Although, I'll get to the hotel later. In the summer of 1893, Minnie's relative, Nanny Williams, came to visit Minnie and Holmes in Chicago. Things seemed well. Although Holmes had involved Minnie in his swindles, just like he had so many others, then in early July, Nanny Williams seemed to drop off the face of the earth, and only a day or so later, Minnie Williams was seen for the last time as well. Holmes wanted to access funds and property owned by Minnie, and on July 6th, several transactions was made to a man named Horace Williams. It was an alias Holmes used to gain access to the property owned by the missing Minnie Williams. It's likely he murdered her, and again, there is a clear monetary motivation. Now, let's talk a little bit about the murder castle, the hotel. Do you want to know the truth about the dreaded Holmes murder castle? Well, the truth is that the third floor never actually functioned as a hotel at all. Holmes had taken several loans, he had gotten investment in form of furniture, and he had made an insurance on the hotel. He claimed it was for the coming World's Fair, but no one actually stayed in the hotel. On the third floor he stored furniture he had received as investment, furniture he would sell and never repay the company for. The hotel was just another scam. The biggest lie. The biggest fib. The grand castle of mayhem, torture, sadism and murder never existed. All that existed was an empty third floor filled with unused furniture. There was no desk, no nightly rates. The third floor had actually been built for as cheap as possible. It was all about earning money. He wanted to spend as little as possible and get investors that he would never repay. Then he got an insurance for the hotel and lit it on fire to claim the insurance. The only room used in the third floor was an office setup. In the office he had a stove, something that would be exaggerated to an extreme extent later on when journalists got to play crime scene investigators. The fire was set by Holmes in the middle of the World's Fair, a time that most people say his hotel was full of customers. The third floor hotel fire was lit on midnight, and no one was at that time inside the hotel. When firemen would go through the rubble, they didn't find any piece of evidence of anyone staying inside the hotel. But Holmes wasn't prepared for the insurance company's relentless investigation. They were examining him carefully, and he did all he could to stay ahead of them. Eventually he gave up. He accepted the fact that he would never receive the insurance money and fled from Chicago. He was at this time doing everything he could to hide from the insurance company agents. He was a wanted man. During this time, Holmes had gotten acquainted with the Petzels. It was Benjamin Petzel, his wife Carrie, and their 5 children. Holmes was involving them both in his swindles and attempts at staying ahead of the insurance companies and their investigators, who was by now building a case against Holmes. He even got Carrie to pretend to be Minnie at one point, but Minnie was of course still missing. Now Holmes had gone west, and he was married to yet another woman. Her name was Georgiana. Holmes, the Petzels, and his new wife moved to Texas to make new swindles, and then Holmes and Benjamin made up a new plan. This time they were going to Philadelphia, and the plan was to sign a property under Benjamin Petzel's name and then fake his death using a cadaver that they would burn, making it look like Benjamin Petzel had died in the fire and collect the life insurance. But it seems like Holmes didn't trust Benjamin. Holmes had his own plans. The day came when the pair was going to pull off the ruse. When the time came, Holmes shoved a napkin with chloroform in his face, and Benjamin fell to the ground. Then Holmes set his body on fire. There is no doubt Holmes had become as cold as can be. Holmes then began another stint on the run. He had someone gotten Carrie to have Holmes in charge of 3 of her children. The baby and the oldest daughter, Desi, stayed with Carrie. The 3 children were Alice, Nellie, and Howard. And Holmes was moving around all of America. He kept his wife, the 3 Petzel kids, and Carrie Petzel with him at all times, but apart. Carrie asked many times where her kids were, and Holmes told her they were safe. Sometimes the mother and the children were in the same city, unaware of each other. And Holmes' wife had no idea that he was in charge of the 3 children. It was a mess, but Holmes was in control. He kept telling Carrie that her husband was in hiding, and he told the 3 children that their mother was at their grandparents' house. It was becoming too risky for him. One of the children knew her father was dead, and Carrie and her oldest daughter Desi knew too much. He needed to get rid of all of the Petzels. He decided to start with the children. He didn't want to risk it being a mess, he wanted to split them up first. He decided that he was going to kill the boy, Howard, first. He rented a house for 2 of the children and took Howard to a separate house. There, he spiked the boy's food with poison and attempted to destroy the remains. A bottle of cyanide would later be found in an adjacent barn. It was kind of sick. Holmes first dismembered the boy and buried some parts of him. The other parts he shoved into the stove along with wood logs and other flammable materials. Holmes moved on to Detroit, and whatever he told Nellie and Alice about their brother's absence is unknown. In Detroit he checked his wife into the hotel, then took the 2 remaining children and put them in another room. Then he contacted Carrie Petzel and told her that her husband and children were waiting for her in Detroit and that she should come. But when she arrived with the oldest daughter and the baby, all she met was Holmes. Holmes told her that he couldn't find a safe place for them to meet just yet, and that she had to wait. She was worried now. What she didn't know was that the room she was living in was only a few minutes away from where her 2 daughters were staying. Holmes were planning to kill Alice and Nessie, and had even dug 2 graves for the girls. But then he got word that investigators were on his trail, so he made a quick escape from Detroit, again moving along all 3 groups separately. Carrie and Desi was getting sick of the stalling. Holmes now told them they had to go to Toronto and sign some papers with Benjamin. He said that the children were in Indianapolis. Reluctantly, Carrie, the baby, and Desi went along. In Toronto, Holmes again told Carrie that they had just missed Benjamin. While in town there was a close call. Holmes had already dug the graves for the 2 Petzel children in a cellar, and while Carrie was out shopping for the baby one day, she met Holmes outside a store she had just been in. Holmes seemed cool and told her he just had to go back inside to get some things. He then rushed inside and never came out. The likeliest explanation is that Carrie's 2 daughters were in there, so close. Holmes then came up to Carrie and once again told her she had to move, this time to Ogdensburg, New York. He told her to hurry, and it didn't take long before she was on a train. But while she was on the train, her 2 daughters were being murdered by HH Holmes. Just because the sadistic stories about Holmes are fake, it doesn't mean that he wasn't a bad person, a horrible person. HH Holmes was a monster, just not the fantastical monster he is made out to be. Rumors after Holmes' arrest would state that he had lured the 2 frightened girls into a trunk where he gassed them to death. But the truth is that he most likely simply poisoned them. He never seemed to want to be too intimate in the killings. Holmes didn't dismember the girls. He simply removed their clothes and buried them. They would be badly decomposed when they were found. Other tenants that rented the house would say that there was a horrible smell coming from the cellar. It didn't matter how many times they cleaned it, the stench wouldn't go away. No one knew that Holmes had buried Alice and Nellie there. Holmes kept dragging Carrie, Desi, and the baby along. At one point he brought Desi, the oldest daughter, out for sightseeing and tried to get her to go to a house where he said her father was. But by this time none of them trusted Holmes anymore. Desi would have been murdered just like her sibling if she had gone with Holmes. He truly was a dangerous man. Now he was planning to kill Carrie. He told her that she was to meet Benjamin in Lowell, Massachusetts. The place they were supposed to meet had been set up with explosives. Although there was never any evidence of explosives being planted, it's very likely he planned to kill the remaining Petzel family in another way. At some point during all of this, Holmes went back to his first wife Clara and told her that he had gotten into an accident and suffered amnesia. The woman was overjoyed, and he was also reunited with his eldest son, now 15 years old. He also reunited with his family, his father and his brother. Holmes seemed to be happy during the visit. He gave his brother money and settled old debts. He was home again, for the last time. He had to move on though. He still had to get rid of the Petzels, But what he didn't know was that the Pinkerton agency had been following him all over New England. He contacted Carrie Petzl and told her to go to Boston, and he went there himself. He didn't get far though. He was cornered by the Pinkertons. HH Holmes was finally caught, and soon the truth would come out. And after the truth came the tale that kept growing bigger and bigger. Holmes would confess to 27 murders, even though only 3 could actually be confirmed. In many instances, the victims he claimed were still alive. They often came to the station themselves, declaring that they were in fact still alive. Many times, these confessions were just petty jabs at people Holmes disliked, just a nuisance to have the last laugh. As police investigated all his properties, they eventually landed on the castle in Chicago. But the police force didn't seem to mind letting journalists from all over the country examine the place. There they made up their own scenarios, made up names for rooms, and claimed regular things like a stove or a cute to be for body disposal. They kept spinning the yarn, and the legend grew. It spread like wildfire. Everyone took the newspapers at their words, as they drew complex drawings of what they said was an elaborate castle filled with murderers' traps. It never was. The story died for a while, but it was resurrected with the book The Devil in the White City, a book that perpetuated the lies. And so, the narrative created by sensationalistic journalists in the late 1800s is still the narrative that's held today. It's an exciting story. It's no doubt fascinating, but I think we're better than that. There are so many details that have been debunked about the fairy tale that Holmes has become. If you're not convinced by this documentary, I urge you to read the book The True History of the White City Devil by Adam Seltzer. That's the book this episode is based on. It has all the evidence you can possibly need, an extreme amount of information on sources and documents. There isn't much more I have to say, except for a few things. Holmes was sentenced to death and was hung by the neck. Some people claimed he faked his own death, but he didn't. That's stupid. Then there is the quotes that was supposedly said by Holmes. He didn't say those either. Another lie perpetrated by sensational journalists. I hope I didn't let you down today. And I am by no means trying to be condescending if you believe the lie. I used to believe the lie too, but it's time to tell the truth. And for that I do thank Adam Seltzer. This would never have been a thing if he hadn't worked so hard to find the truth. HH Holmes is not America's first serial killer either. The Harp brothers were killing people almost 100 years before Holmes, and Dr. Neil Cream was killing people before Holmes. So, Holmes isn't even Chicago's first serial killer. And even though he never was the devil you knew, he was an evil man. He left Carrie Petzl in ruins, killing 3 of her children and her husband, all for his own gain. And technically I guess you can't call Holmes building a murder castle. He did after all kill 3 people there. Or he most likely killed them. Alice and her daughter Pearl and Emmeline. Please don't perpetuate the lie. Because at the end of the day, it all comes down to one man, one source, one seed. And that seed is H. Holmes.
Holmes's hotel was called a murder castle because it was literally built to murder people. Each room was rigged to kill you either via gas or asphyxiation or what have you, and once you were good and dead, there was a system of tunnels that would drop your dead body into the basement.
Holmes made all of these rooms soundproof. Each room was made for a different type of murder. There were chambers for hanging, suffocating. There were trapdoor rooms that the only way you could get out was through the trapdoor in the ceilings.
In Chicago, on the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets, he began designing this huge mammoth of a building that locals called the Castle because it was a hotel that was huge. It was like a strange shape to it. It's fascinating when you look up like photos of all of the rooms and the original construction plans and everything. The building had originally been kind of designed to be a 3-story hotel, but he constantly would change the construction plans. He would add new rooms, he'd add new layers, he'd add new floors, change corridors, move rooms, everything. He'd add new doors in where there didn't need to be a door. And he fired and hired constantly new construction teams, presumably kind of in hopes of no one ever really finding out what he had planned.
Business to the public and created a hotel. Now there's some evidence that this hotel was never actually legitimate. He just advertised it as so to bring in these victims. We honestly don't even know what he did in these rooms, or if he had any torture devices, or anything about what actually happened inside of this murder castle, because he was so secretive about it. And everything was planned inside the building itself so meticulously that he could hide absolutely everything and dispose of the bodies in such a way that we really weren't even able to find.
The layout of the building. And then the murders began. He mostly selected female victims from among his employees. He murdered by locking people in soundproof bedrooms fitted with gas lines where they could be asphyxiated at any time. He hanged them in secret hanging chambers. He locked them in a vault where they would suffocate. He would throw them in a secret room that was solid brick on all sides with only a trap